Hi, everybody. I am going to talk a little bit about two articles I had you read by Bell Hooks. One is in this book, Black Looks. I'm going to look at the chapter one entitled Eating the Other. And then I'm going to take a look at and talk a little bit about one of the essays over here in this book as well, which I post on Canvas for you all, and the article is entitled In Our Glory, Photography and Black Life. Bell Hooks is an American philosopher, an African-American feminist philosopher. She lives in Kentucky and teaches at a small college there, I believe, called Berea College, which is has a very unique model of learning. Bell Hooks is pretty prolific, and she has written for a while now. This book, Black Looks, is from, I believe, it's from the 1990s. A little bit older, but I think that, so you may have noticed that some of the writings, they make cultural references from that period, but I think they're still quite pertinent. And it's a shame we're not meeting in person to have, to discuss to what extent her critiques are still relevant. But we can do that online during our Zoom meeting. This latter book here, Art on My Mind, this is a collection of essays she's written also from the mid-90s. I believe they're both collections of essays. Black Looks, I think, is her best-known book. Any case, let me dive into, and by the way, this is just as a means of introducing you to her thought, and is by no means meant to be exhaustive. When we talk on our Zoom meeting, we can cover some more stuff. But consider this a primer. In the essay Eating the Other, Bell Hooks raises a famous theme here, or at least a theme that she is famous for, called the commodification of otherness. She says this is where she gets the term eating the other, commodification of otherness, images of others, and that's others with a capital O, such as African Americans, various minorities who are considered other from the white heteronormative majority. These are viewed with a kind of fascination, and through media portrayals and photography and film in particular, these others end up being commodified, kind of tragic and paradoxical result. She says this, quote, eating the other is often dressed up or justified as affirming pluralism. And here's what she says to that on page 24 in Eating the Other. In the middle of the page, she says, and this is about white boys. They see their willingness to openly name their desire for the other as affirmation of cultural plurality. Its impact on sexual preference and choice, unlike racist white men who historically violated the bodies of black women or women of color to assert their position as colonizer conqueror, these young men see themselves as non-racists who choose to transgress racial boundaries within the sexual realm, not to dominate the other, but rather so they can be acted upon, so that they can be changed utterly. Not at all attuned to those aspects of their sexual fantasies that irrevocably link them to collective white racist domination, they believe their desire for contact represents a progressive change in white attitudes for non-whites towards non-whites. They do not see themselves as perpetuating racism. Interesting argument here, controversial argument, in the media portrayals of African Americans, and I think she has in mind particularly advertisements. African Americans are, there may be a certain cultural generosity sensed on the part of whites, right? Look how comfortable we are with representations of African Americans, this kind of otherness. And what they do not see is that this is perpetuating racism. This is perpetuating it's not necessarily even perpetuating stereotypes, but it is a kind of consumption. That's the point. It's a consumption of otherness that does not respect the other. She says elsewhere that a conversion experience is sought after in eating the other. This is around that same page, maybe it's around the next page, page 25, in the middle of the page. The desire to become the other because of all that the other represents. What is it that the other represents? Well, this is the middle of page 25. She says, the desire to make contact with those bodies deemed other with no apparent will to dominate assuages the guilt of the past, even takes the form of a defiant gesture where one denies accountability and historical connection. Most importantly, it establishes a contemporary narrative where the suffering imposed by structures of domination on those designated other is deflected by the emphasis on seduction and longing, where the desire is not to make the other over one's image, but to become the other. This desire, sorry, I hear a kid calling me in the background. Let me just focus here. This desire to make contact with these bodies. Again, this seems to be progressive, if you will, but it is not so much progressive as it, this kind of yearning is to consume and become and to be filled with all that, as she says above that, that there's a narrative fantasy of power and desire, of seduction of the primitive in the other. And this commodification of their imagery is an attempt to tap into all that, if you will, but it bypasses a history of oppression. And so this is the danger that's lurking beneath perceived pluralism in the media. As to her cultural diagnosis of the times, well, there is something wrong with the youth and our society that allows for this. And essentially, she tells us here at the bottom, page 25, that the youth, and I guess she has in mind especially the white youth, is suffering from a crisis of identity. She talks about a cultural ennui, and this is driving, and I guess I'd like to hear more about that if people are willing to share, what that is, why that exists, and how that is still manifest. She talks about, on page 25 at the very bottom, a contemporary crises of identity in the West that are afflicting primarily white youth, driving them to look for and adopt images they see in minorities. But this is compounded, if you will, by the other driver, which is that capitalism is constantly looking to innovate commodity. Capitalism is constantly looking for images that can be commodified and used as to market things. And so these two together are leading to this tendency to commodify otherness. She goes on the next page to talk more about, how these representations of otherness perpetuate racism. And among the other things, she complains that these representations that white people like is a world where black people are in harmony with nature. Also, the other is exciting, dangerous, unexpected, pleasurable. Here's a nice quote at the bottom of 26. She says, encounters with otherness are clearly marked as more exciting, more intense, and more threatening. The allure is a combination of pleasure and danger. In the cultural marketplace, the other is coded as having the capacity to be more alive, as holding the secret that will allow those who venture and dare to break with the cultural anhedonia, as defined in Sam Keen's The Passion Life, as the insensitivity to pleasure, the capacity for experiencing happiness, and experience sensual and spiritual renewal. Right. So if you suspect that your life is boring, if you suspect that it's falling short of requisite excitement, then minorities, otherness, can pose as a seductive terrain for you to enliven things. But that effectively objectifies the other, right? That means that otherness is subject to a kind of colonial stereotype, right? Again, this idea that the black body is foreign territory. It is mysterious. It is wild, if you will. And she continues by quoting Foucault at the top of 27, which I think falls along these lines. She says that though speaking from the standpoint after a quote of Foucault, she's analyzing it. She says, though speaking from the standpoint of his individual experience, Foucault voices a dilemma felt by many in the West. It is precisely that longing for the pleasure that has led the white West to sustain romantic fantasy of the primitive and the concrete search for a real primitive paradise, whether that location be a country or a body, a dark continent or dark flesh perceived as the perfect embodiment of that possibility. A primitive paradise, as if that thing could exist and is waiting for to be colonized again by white people. Commodification, she goes on to argue, disarms the political power of signs and representations. There are probably numerous examples that we could all come up with, but I'm thinking in particular of Che Guevara, who was very, fancy and mysterious revolutionary leader who helped Fidel Castro, and then he was gunned down in South America. His image with his beret on the side and his cigar in his mouth, this was used repeatedly to sell T-shirts and posters, and an entire generation of youth grew up completely ignorant of the political meaning and power of that image. They were lured in, of course, by the apparent mystery, but then did not really care to understand, or maybe not even if they didn't even care to understand, they were completely unaware of what the political meaning of that image was. She says when commodified, it's easy for consumers to ignore political messages. That is just the dynamic of commodification. And I think from a certain point, she likes to say that commodification looks for those tantalizing images. It's constantly on the lookout for borderline rebellious messages that can be, subsumed. Think maybe about the various mottos that brands have taken in, and they in some cases, I guess you could say, they even sound like a kind of shorthand for revolutionary or potentially revolutionary causes. I'd have to do some thinking, but we could work through some of these mottos of these brands to see how that is the case. She tells us here on page 34, compelling quote in the middle of the page, she says, and here she's talking about white appetite for rap music. She says in the middle of page 34, Black youth culture comes to stand for the outer limits of outness. The commercial nexus exploits the culture's desire, expressed by whites and blacks, to inscribe blackness as a primitive sign of as wildness. And with it, the suggestion that black people have secret access to intense pleasure, particularly pleasures of the body. It's the young black male body that is seen as epitomizing the promise of wildness, of unlimited physical prowess and unbridled eroticism. it was this black body that was most desired for its labor in slavery. And it is this body that is most represented in contemporary popular culture as the body to be watched, imitated, desired, possessed. Rather than a sign of pleasure in daily life outside the realm of consumption, the young black male body is represented most graphically as a body in pain. And here I guess we could talk about Black Lives Matter movement and how African American bodies are bodies in pain. Though that's the other competing image of them in the media, and yet those images do not circulate. Those images resist commodification, or commodification spurns them. For certain, they are not the kind of images that a white commercial audience is interested in. Okay. At this point, I'm going to switch over now and talk about this essay, In Our Glory, Photography and the Black Life. She considers here the importance of cameras to Black life, and she says that thanks to this emergence of this tool, Blacks could now participate fully in the production of images. Why is this important? Well, this leads to a protracted discussion of the history of Black liberation movements in the U.S., and she says that they are, at this movement, that Black liberation is as much a struggle over images as it is a struggle over equal rights. In fact, civil rights leaders focused on equal access, but not images, and they made gains with equal access, but she argues they came to the agreement that the struggle over images requires at least equal attention now. This suggests that equal rights and equal access is lacking or deficient so long as there is no similar attention to aesthetics, which is a very important claim for her. Equal rights, the legal battle must be complemented by an aesthetic battle as well for to conquer or to claw back and then reestablish the images of Black people as they are, that are other than commodification. Consider this powerful quote on page 58 here. She says at the top of the page, she's quoting Roger Wilkins here. In those innocent days before desegregation had really been tried, before the new frontier and the Great Society, that's in the 1960s, civil rights movements, many of us Blacks had lovely naive hopes for integration. In our naivete, we believed that the power to segregate was the greatest power that had been wielded against us. It turned out that our expectations were wrong. The greatest power turned out to be what it had always been, the power to define reality where Blacks are concerned and to manage perceptions and therefore arrange politics and culture to reinforce those definitions. This is where the importance of aesthetics comes in. It is defining reality, who is real. And who is real and what is real is, like it or not, an extension of media portrayals. Here is her main contention in the middle of 58. She says, in part, racial desegregation, or equal access, offered a vision of racial progress that, however limited, led many Black people to be less vigilant about the question of representation. Concurrently, contemporary commodification of Blackness creates a market context wherein conventional, even stereotypical modes of representing Blackness may receive the greatest reward. This leads to a cultural context in which images that would subvert the status quo are harder to produce. There is no perceived market for them. Market conditions are what dominate which images circulate. Subversive images of African Americans, and those are images that are subversive to market demands, do not get to circulate. And that is something that African Americans should be vigilant of, at least as much as the question of representation. So commodification supplies the preponderant images of African Americans, but these are merely stereotypes, again, or still. Subversive images or representations of African Americans are rejected because they are not marketable. She claims that nationalist black freedom movements, quote, promoted notions of essence and identity that ultimately restricted and confined black image production. That's a quote on page 58 at the bottom of the page. Maybe the better word is, or another word is, that they conceded to those representations because, there was relief that at least there are some representations of African Americans in the media. But again, what kind of diversity of those media representations? This is why photography was so politically significant. She says it, quote, offered the possibility of immediate intervention, useful in the production of counter-hegemonic representations. Roughly speaking, African Americans could now interject and offer and provide their own images that would be subversive to market demands and commodification. The main and interesting issue in this essay, which we will explore more on in our Zoom discussion, is her claim that political representation is only part of the battle when it comes to liberation and civil rights. That it must be matched at the very least by a powerful aesthetic charge, an aesthetic campaign, which is a liberation similarly of the black image, so that it can transcend commodification and can transcend any kind of limitation that is imposed on it, or limited expectations imposed on it by white eyes. Okay, and white appetites. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I will see you all very soon.